Mr. President, thank you so much for your time. We meet here in Havana during a very difficult time for your country. And before we start speaking about the situation here in Cuba, the US President Donald Trump has been speaking in the last few hours, and he's been talking about Cuba. He says after many, many decades, it's coming our way. He continues to talk about taking Cuba. He is continuing to make threats against your government. I just want you to react to his latest statements.
I believe that those of us who hold political positions representing our people at the helm of the nation in a challenging world with so many problems, we should all promote a friendly relation, a relationship that would ensure peace and security, that each of our nations and each of our different regions and also in the world to step away from confrontation and wars, that we settle conflicts not through force, and we should always stand up for multilateralism, and as part of multilateralism, we use dialogue in order to settle bilateral disputes or differences or multilateral issues. Anything different from that would be a pity. It would not be a contribution to a world in peace in which we want to live. Threats, the constant rhetoric of about an aggression against our country by the U.S. government, the almost daily expressions which are part of a strategy of a media-driven intoxication and psychological warfare in order to frighten our country and destabilize our society is an outrage and an affront to the dignity of our people. And they're also a flagrant violation of international law. Firstly, Cuba is a sovereign country. Cuba achieved its independence after more than 100 years of struggle, first against Spanish colonialism, and then after the U.S. intervention and the country's dependence on the U.S. government as a neo-colony. We have embraced a cause, and we're trying to build a model which is our own. We are not going to impose it on anyone else, but this is the way we want to develop our country. We are a peaceful country. We are not a threat to anyone. We provide a lot of solidarity to the world. Therefore, Cuba is not a nation in conflict. We're not a colony. We're not going to give in our sovereignty or independence. These are principles that we must preserve and uphold. Therefore, we believe that there is an exaggeration. There are no moral or legal authority on any ruler from the United States in order to impose a policy that seeks to attack Cuba or take over Cuba.
But do you believe they are going to use force and an attack is imminent?
That would be speculating, because there's a mixture of political interests. The current U.S. administration is deeply committed to the Miami-based Cuban mafia, and therefore they're playing to their electorate base. And we are close to elections in the U.S., and they're trying to be condescending and playing to the interests of those voters. So you have those political interests. On the other hand, there is a lot of rhetoric, there is a lot of manipulation, and what's clear for us is that there is a threat. I wouldn't be able to tell you whether they're going to go with it or not, but there is a threat, and it is an asymmetrical threat. You have the United States, which is playing the role of the aggressor, and the United States is escalating its rhetoric about threats and a potential intervention. And that puts us in alert. If there is an attack, the Cuban people will respond in unity, firmness, and in defense of our sovereignty. We don't want the war, but we're not afraid of it, and we are getting ready so that we're not surprised or defeated.
And we can talk about how you're getting ready in a moment, but we have seen a military buildup off your coast. When Donald Trump has threatened Venezuela, for example, he has acted. When he has threatened Iran, he has acted. I know you're saying that me asking whether an attack being imminent is hypothetical, but we've seen in the past when he has said something, he has done it. Are you taking what he is saying seriously when he says we can take Cuba?
Well, those are the things that he said, and that's the way he's projecting himself towards a public opinion. I mean, the President of the United States. When the President of the United States and other spokesperson of that government maintain that position, for us, that means there's an alert, and we have the full responsibility to be ready in order to avoid a confrontation. What's most important here is that we need to move away from confrontation for the sake of both our peoples. I think that the American people, for which we are respectful, and the Cuban people can have a wonderful relationship as very good neighbors because we're very close to each other. And we can share, as has been proved at other times when relations have been at a more favorable situation, we can have many shared projects and businesses and art and education and culture, scientific research. There are so many common areas that could be addressed jointly and also as peoples. We don't like to be compared with what has happened elsewhere because that would be tantamount to ignoring our history and not knowing the strength of our institution and the sense of unity in our people and the sense of appreciation of our sovereignty and independence.
How you say you're getting ready militarily because you're taking this threat seriously. How are you getting ready, and do you honestly think you can take on the might of the US military, given it is the most powerful military in the world?
Fidel taught us that there are no invincible enemies, and there may be very powerful armies. Technologically speaking, there might be even powerful armies numerically, but also in conflicts there is convictions and the decisions made by the peoples and the sacrifices that peoples are willing to make for the defense of their sovereignty and independence. And there's also the history and tradition of those peoples. There is an important hero of our independence wars, Major General Antonio Maceo, Deputy Chief of our independent army and liberation army at a time when we were a Spanish colony. And he said, whoever tries to take over Cuba will only be able to take the dust of his soil drenched in blood. It is not just a slogan, it is a conviction that has been taken up by millions of Cubans, and there are...
Is that what you're telling Donald Trump? Is that the message to Donald Trump?
I'm not really interested in sending a message to the President of the United States. I'm just making a reflection. I'm just referring to a number of issues that we are discussing that are very topical and issues that means a lot of danger to our country, and I'm doing this in order to provide information and express our views and our convictions on these issues and show that to the American public and the people of the United States, which, as I said earlier, we respect and admire immensely. And specifically because we are also convinced that the most important thing is to step away from confrontation. But I was mentioning that it's not only the military might that counts, the military might in a conflict of one army over another one, but also the decisions of the peoples count. In the history of mankind, there are empires that fell, being supposedly more powerful because there were other attitudes on the part of their adversaries. And I was mentioning an example as the convictions in the history of Cuba. But there's a more recent example. Elite troops from the American army illegally abducted the president of Venezuela and his wife, and they extracted them from Venezuela in order to try them as an excuse they used to try them in the United States. There were a number of Cubans who were working for the protection of President Maduro in Venezuela. Those Cubans, because of their convictions, they fought those forces, and they were outnumbered, they were in a technological disadvantage, and also they were under the surprise of the attack. And a military operation that had been designed to take place for only a few minutes to come in and extract the president lasted more than 40-something minutes, and 32 Cubans gave their lives in that heroic action. Those 32 Cubans can be multiplied into millions here in Cuba. What would it mean, millions of Cuba defending their independence and sovereignty, even if they're facing the most powerful army in the world? But looking at it from a different angle, we are willing to defend ourselves. But I think that the most constructive thing would be that we don't get to that point. That adventure will cost the loss of human lives, both for the American people and for the Cuban people.
You just gave the example of what happened in Venezuela, and the world saw and watched the way that the US military arrested Nicolas Maduro and took him and have held him in a US prison. Are you not worried, though, that even if that operation that you say was only supposed to take a few minutes took 46 minutes, are you not worried that that could happen to you as well? I mean, they've indicted Raul Castro, for example. Are you not worried that you are now in their crosshairs? They are saying things like they want to arrest Raul Castro.
Mira,
I have been asked that question several times. And everything goes through the attitude you have in life and in face of the complexities of life. When you take on a responsibility with a process like the process of the Cuban Revolution, I was born in the early years of the revolution, and the revolution has instilled a number of values and convictions. And I, like many other million Cubans, are willing to give our lives for the revolution. And we are willing to fight to the very last drop of blood in order to defend our rights, and our independence, our sovereignty, and our achievements. When you take on that attitude in Cuba, you're not concerned and you're not afraid. You are enormously responsible to avoid that situation in our position at the helm of the country. But the concern and the fear is not there, because we've already taken up that attitude based on our convictions in face of such a situation like this.
You're banking on the fact that Cubans will rise and defend their country if there is aggression from the United States. The US president is banking on the fact that if your government, your regime collapses, the Cuban people will rise up and take control of their country. How do you think this will end?
I believe that if we're saying that we want to engage and we want to hold discussions and we want to find a solution through dialogue in order to address our bilateral differences, why do we have to use and put the situations in that crossroads, saying like, if the U.S. government is going to say this, if the government of the U.S. says that it's going to do that, what are you going to do? What are you willing to do? What are the possibilities of success? Why don't we ask the questions the other way around? Why don't we ask ourselves, what we need to do in order to avoid that? What would happen? Who would win?
por expresarlo de una
just
manera muy
frame it
simplista,
in a very simple way.
es un poco limitar el
Doing that
problema,
would be
es
limiting the
reducirlo
problem.
a
I
la
would be
esencia de lo que
reducing the
es. Yo
problem
diría,
to a very
¿qué
simple
razones
essence.
hay
I would
para que el gobierno de
instead
los
ask,
Estados Unidos
what
lo
are
que
the
tenga en su
reasons for the United
pensamiento
States government
sea la
to think
decisión
about
o la
or
intención
to have the
de agredir
intent
a Cuba y de
to
apoderarse
attack
de
Cuba
Cuba?
and
¿Bajo
take
qué
over
derecho?
Cuba?
¿Bajo qué
Based on
pretexto?
which rights?
¿Qué lo
Based
ampara
on which
legalmente?
excuse?
¿Qué lo
What are
ampara,
the legal reasons to do
desde el
that?
punto de vista humano, desde el punto de vista
What are the
racional,
human point
que
of
esa
view to
tenga
do
que ser la
that?
obsesión del gobierno de
Why
los
does
Estados
that have
Unidos?
to
¿Qué
be the
obsesión
obsession
del
of the
gobierno de
U.S.
Estados Unidos?
government?
No
Why
es
doesn't the
cómo
U.S.
podemos vivir
government
como buenos
ask
vecinos.
why can we
¿Cómo
live
podemos
like very good neighbors?
reconocer que tenemos diferencias
Why can
ideológicas,
they
que tenemos
recognize that we
diferencias
have
políticas como las
political
tiene
and
con otros
ideological
lugares del
differences
mundo,
like they do
y
with other
poder
countries around the world
construir una
and try
relación
and build a
civilizada
civilized
que nos
relationship
permita,
that would
independientemente de
enable
nuestras
us,
diferencias,
in spite of
abordar
our differences,
otros puntos
to
de vista,
address
encontrar áreas,
other
encontrar zonas donde podamos
areas where
cooperar,
we can cooperate
construir
and
espacios
build
que nos
spaces
permitan garantizar la
enabling us
seguridad
to ensure
nacional tanto de los Estados Unidos
national
como
security
Cuba,
of both of the
cooperar
United
con
States and Cuba,
mantener la
as well
seguridad
as maintaining
en la
security
región,
in the
y además de
region,
eso, crear
and
una
at the same time
confianza
creating and
que nos
building
permita construir
a
un
trust
diálogo
that
que
would
nos
enable
aleje de
us
la
to build
confrontación. Yo
dialogue
creo que lo
and
que
move us
merecen
away
los
from
pueblos
confrontation.
de Cuba y
What the
Estados
people
Unidos
of
no es que
Cuba and the United
constantemente
States deserve
nos estemos
is not that
diciendo
we are
cómo nos vamos a
constantly how
enfrentar
we're going to
o tengamos que estar
face off each other.
encontrando uno
Or
cómo nos va a agredir
we
y
need to
otro
think
cómo se va
how
a defender.
one is going to
Por
attack
el
the other and
contrario,
how the other is
en
going
lo
to
que
defend
deberíamos
itself.
estar
Quite the
involucrados
contrary.
todos
What we all
es cómo
should be
vamos a
thinking
resolver
about is
nuestras
how
diferencias
we're going
y
to
cómo vamos
solve
a
our
crear
differences
realmente
and
un
how we're
espacio de
going
paz,
to
un
build
espacio
a
de
space for peace
comprensión
and
entre
understanding
nosotros.
between us.
What we have now is a US president who's also said for 50 or 60 years other US presidents have tried to do something about Cuba, and it's going to come down to him. That is why I'm asking about the seriousness of this moment for you and your country. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has said we want to resolve this diplomatically, but we're dealing with your government, and he doesn't believe that that's possible. As I said, we've also seen this military build-up. So we can talk about what sort of deal you'd like to put on the table, whether you'd like to reach some kind of deal with the Americans so that you're not in this situation where you feel threatened and like you're dealing with some kind of confrontation. But the US president also sent his CIA chief to your country. What message did he have? Because he is talking about Cuba being a national security threat.
A ver, yo creo que los representantes actuales del gobierno
I
de
believe
los
that
Estados
the
Unidos
current representatives of the United States government have been telling lots of lies.
manipulan mucho la opinión
They
pública.
have manipulated international public opinion quite a lot.
Un momento importante de
Firstly,
reconocimiento del
an
bloqueo
important moment of the worsening of the blockade
momentos de máxima presión,
to the point of
estamos
maximum
viendo ahora
pressure,
con
which is
todo
what we're going through right now,
los problemas que causan la vida
and
cotidiana
taking
de
into
los
account all
cubanos.
of the major problems it's
Y los
causing
cubanos
to
tiene
the
que ver
daily
con la
life
orden
of
ejecutiva
Cubans,
del 29
has to
de
do
enero,
with the executive order
con la cual se
of
decretó
29
un
January,
cerco energético
when they
a nuestro
decreed
país,
a
condena a un
fuel
país
siege
a
against that
vivir sin
country,
energía.
and is condemning
Eso es
a
un crimen.
country to live without energy.
Eso es
That's a
un genocidio.
crime.
Pero
That's
además el
genocide.
pretexto que han usado
In addition,
para aplicar
the
esa orden
excuse that they have
ejecutiva
used in order to
es la
pass that
consideración,
executive order
y la expresó el presidente de
is
los
the
Estados
consideration, and this is something
Unidos,
that
de que Cuba es
the
una amenaza
President of the United
inusual
States
y
said
extraordinaria,
was that Cuba is an
para la
unusual
seguridad de
and
los
extraordinary threat to the security of the United States.
aunque no es tu rol porque tú eres
And
la
although
entrevistadora,
it
yo
is
te
not your role
preguntaría a
because
ti,
you are the
como
interviewer,
ciudadana,
do
¿es
you
una
really
amenaza
believe
para
that
la
this island
seguridad
can pose a
de los
threat to
Estados
the United
Unidos,
States
además una amenaza
security?
extraordinaria, inusual
In addition,
para la
an
seguridad de los Estados Unidos? Eso es
unusual
una
and
conclusión
extraordinary threat to
mentirosa.
the United States
Es una-
security.
es una-
That's
es una
a
falacia.
lie. That's a fallacy.
What the Americans are saying is that you have allowed Chinese and Russian surveillance bases, that they have seen this through satellite imagery, that the island, is this not true?
Por eso te digo que son
That's why I'm
construcciones
telling
que
you these
parten
are
de una calumnia, una
constructs
manipulación
based on
y de una
manipulation
mentira, que demuestran dónde está la base.
and
Que
lies.
busquen cuáles son los
Can they
chinos y
show
los
where the
rusos.
So the
bases are there?
Chinese, the
No hay
Russians
bases
are
chinas,
not.
no
There
hay
are no
bases
Chinese
chinas ni
bases
rusas
in Cuba.
Lo hemos dicho en
We've
varias
said that
ocasiones.
several times.
Lo hemos
We've
afirmado.
stated
Lo que
that
pasa es que los
what
medios
happens is
masivos
that
de
the
comunicación
mainstream media
todos los algoritmos
and all
de
of the
redes
algorithm in
generalmente
social
están
media are
subordinados
usually
a los
subordinated to
intereses de la
the
política norteamericana.
interest of
So
the
the
American
satellite
policy.
imagery,
Se imponen esas
Therefore, they impose those narrative and those views, and it is very difficult for the voices of the global South and the voices of developing countries, and particularly as the voice of a small country like Cuba, to be heard and to be taken into account. But I say, let's go back in our history. When in our history has Cuba made any aggressive action against the United States? The nature of Cubans is friendliness, cooperation. We are not a problem. We don't want to attack the United States. We want to live in peace. We have a lot of things to do for the development of our country and to achieve the prosperity that the Cuban people deserves for its heroic nature. What has been Cuba's sin? Just trying to build socialism only 90 miles off from the United States? Well, it's being our decision. This is what our people has decided in its majority. We're not telling the U.S. to change their political system, let alone think about attacking the United States for them to change the political system. So you asked me about dialogue. I believe that there are possibilities for dialogue, but it is difficult. Why are there possibilities? Well, Cuba has historically been in favor of that since the triumph of the revolution led by Commander-in-Chief Fidel Castro, and also with the continuity with Army General Raúl Castro. And this is our position, the younger generations that have taken the leadership of the main tasks of the revolution. We've been meaning to establish a dialogue and engage in a dialogue with the United States so that we can solve our bilateral issues through dialogue and find a number of areas for cooperation, to build trust, and to move away from confrontation. But it has to be without any previous condition. It has to be based on respect for our sovereignty and our system, our political system. It has to be a dialogue where we apply the principle of reciprocity and where international law is respected. We have maintained this position, and we've said that several times regarding the United States. We've said it publicly. Well, now, why is it difficult? In the history of the United States and Cuba, I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but in the history of Cuba and the United States, there's always been the position of an aggressing power, which is the United States, and a small island, which has been under attack, which is Cuba. Furthermore, the various attempts of dialogue are not only from this time. In several other administrations and at some other times, there has been attempts to engage in dialogue, or channels for dialogue have been built. But when we have established the possibilities for dialogue, we have not been able to make much progress because there's always been this ultra-conservative thinking in some sectors of the United States, and they have undermined those attempts for dialogue and those talks. Moreover, when we've had a dialogue, when we have achieved achievements, I can tell you in full responsibility that Cuba has fulfilled and has stood by all of its agreements, and the United States have not fulfilled their part of the deal. And the other element that makes this dialogue and this conversation, these talks, more difficult and achieving solutions that are fruitful for both countries rest with the current attitude of the United States administration. There is distrust saying that there is distrust in the Cuban population as to how this dialogue may move on, because supposedly we have, on the one hand, that both sides, that the Venezuelan government and the American government were engaged in a dialogue, and in the middle of that, there is an attack, and they kidnapped the president. Also, they said that there was a dialogue between the U.S. government and the government of Iran. And in the middle of the dialogue, the United States attacked the Islamic Republic of Iran. So people have this distrust that we're trying to move towards this dialogue, and constantly the U.S. representatives and people from the State Department are saying that Cuba is a failed state, that we are incompetent, that we don't accept humanitarian aid, that we have Chinese and Russian bases
en Cuba que
in
nosotros somos una
Cuba that
amenaza
we pose
inusual y
an
extraordinaria
unusual and extraordinary
para la
threat to
seguridad de los
the
Estados Unidos
United
y
States and
constantemente
national
están
security,
levantando
and they're
el lenguaje de
constantly
la agresión,
using
la
the
retórica de
war
la
of
guerra
confrontation,
y
the
las
rhetoric
amenazas
of war,
hacia
and the
Cuba.
threats
Cuesta mucho
against Cuba.
trabajo.
So it is
En
very
una situación
difficult
como esa, porque
in a
yo creo que
situation
para que haya
like
un
this
diálogo, que es
to
a
do
lo que
that, because
nosotros
in order to
aspiramos,
achieve that dialogue, which is
exista una
what we
disposición de
hope
ambas
for,
partes
there has to be
de
some
encontrar
willingness on
cuáles
both
son los
sides
puntos comunes
to
en los
find
que
the common
podemos
ground
avanzar.
so that we can make
One of the
progress.
things that the Americans are saying is that they want your system to change, the economy to open up. I have been, Mr. President, in Havana for the last few days. I've seen the impact of the blockade on your country, the fuel shortages, the hospitals that are struggling. We've seen piles of rubbish throughout the city. It's been incredibly difficult to see how difficult the suffering of the people here has been. And I appreciate that you will say that the bulk of this is because of the blockade, but people that I've been speaking to have also been saying it's not entirely Washington's fault, that it's also your fault. What responsibility do you take for the suffering of your people?
Nosotros siempre hemos reconocido
We've
errores
always
que cometemos
recognized
y
the
la
mistakes we've
revolución
made,
por
and the
mantenernos ha
revolution
estado siendo
has
autocrítica
constantly
y como parte de la
being
autocrítica y de la crítica
self-critical, and as part
compartida
of
con el
that
pueblo,
criticism shared
hemos
with
ido
the people,
superando
we've been
problemas. Lo que pasa
overcoming
es que estamos
problems.
viviendo una situación
What happens is that
excepcional.
we are going through a
Una
very
situación
exceptional
excepcional. Nosotros llevamos
situation.
más de 60 años de
We've
bloqueo.
been under the blockade for
El
60
bloqueo más
years. It is the
prolongado
longest
en la
running
historia de la humanidad.
blockade in the history of
Y no es un
mankind,
bloqueo
and it's
cualquiera.
not just any
Es un bloqueo
blockade, it is an economic,
financiero,
financial,
comercial,
commercial blockade,
y ahora
and
energético.
now an energy
Y no lo está
blockade.
imponiendo cualquier país,
And
lo
this
está
blockade
poniendo-
is
lo
not
está
being
imponiendo
imposed by
la
any
potencia
country,
más
it is being
poderosa
imposed by
del
the
mundo.
mightiest
La
power in
potencia
the world,
que jerarquiza
the
en el
power
mundo el uso de las divisas,
that controls
la
the use
finanza,
of
el
hard
comercio
currency, finance,
y lo
trade,
energético.
and energy globally.
Entonces, lo más perverso
So the
que
most
tiene el bloqueo
perverse thing about
es
the
lo
blockade
prolongado que ha sido en el
is
tiempo.
how long it has
Y la mayor
taken place
ofensa
in time.
a Cuba, al pueblo cubano que
And the
sufrimos
biggest
el
affront
bloqueo todos
to
los
Cuba
días,
and the Cuban people
y que
who
ahora
are
lo estamos
suffering the
sufriendo de
blockade on a
manera
daily
recrudecida.
basis, and now
y al mundo
in a
que está en
tightened
contra de ese
blockade,
bloqueo,
and the world
es
that is
la
against the
construcción
blockade
narrativa del gobierno de los
is the
Estados Unidos
narrative
para
made
invisibilizar
by the
al
US government
principal
in order
culpable de la
to
situación que tiene Cuba hoy, que es el
hide the
bloqueo, y
main
culpar
culprit of the
al
Cuban
gobierno
situation
cubano
right now,
o a
which
lo
is
que
the
ellos
blockade, and
consideran
then
Estado
put the
fallido. Mira,
blame
Cuba no es un
on
Estado
the
fallido. Si
on the
nosotros
Cuban
fuéramos un Estado
government.
fallido, ya no
Cuba
existiera
is
la-
not a
you
failed
take
state.
some responsibility for your system and that it has failed the Cuban people. It's not just the blockade.
Voy a explicarte. Nosotros
Let me explain.
asumimos la responsabilidad
We
de lo que tenemos,
take on the responsibility
de lo que tenemos que perfeccionar,
of the
de lo
things
que no
that we
hemos
need
sido
to
capaces
improve,
de
the
lograr,
things
de
that
los
we have
sueños
not
que
been able
tenemos
to
y que
achieve,
han sido adheridos
and the
al
things that
bloqueo.
we have to
Pero
postpone
aunque
because of
nosotros
the
hubiéramos hecho
blockade.
todo perfecto,
But
el país estuviera viviendo la situación que está
if we
viviendo
had done
sencillamente
everything
porque el
perfectly, the
principal
country
causante
would be
de
living a
nuestros
situation
problemas
like this
es el bloqueo, y
because
te
the
voy a poner
main
algunas cifras.
cause of this is the blockade. And let me
Que
give you
haya más de
some
20 horas
figures.
de apagón
The fact that we have
no es una
20
incapacidad de
hours
nuestro
or
sistema
more of
electroenergético
power
nacional.
cuts is not the inability of
Nuestros-
our
nuestros
national power
técnicos,
grid.
nuestros
Our
ingenieros,
technicians, our
nuestros
engineers
especialistas del sistema
of
electroenergético
the
nacional, nuestros
power
trabajadores
industry,
son heroicos.
our heroes,
Son capaces
they
de
can
mantener
maintain
plantas eléctricas
power
que ya son
plants which are
obsoletas,
dated,
trabajando con crudo
working
nacional, que es un
on
crudo
national
pesado,
crude oil, which is a heavy oil,
sencillamente por su talento y por su
purely
conocimiento.
on the
Y esas
basis of their
plantas
talent and
sencillamente
knowledge.
no se pueden
And these
reparar, ni
power
pueden
plants
tener los
cannot
ciclos
be
de
repaired
mantenimiento
or
que
go
podrían tener
through their
por los
normal
efectos del bloqueo,
maintenance
porque el bloqueo
cycles
ha cerrado
because
la
of the
llave de la
blockade,
entrada
because the
de la
blockade
entrada de
has
divisas al
shut
país.
off the
El
valve
bloqueo
for
You have created-
el bloqueo
currency into
impide-
Cuba.
You've created a system where you've been completely
Déjame terminar,
dependent.
déjame
Let me
terminar
finish
una idea.
this idea.
El-
The
el
blockade
bloqueo
is
impide que
preventing
entren las
hard
finanzas a
currency to
Cuba.
come into Cuba.
El bloqueo
The
impide
blockade
que a Cuba se
prevents
le dé
Cuba
crédito.
from getting
El
loans
bloqueo
and
impide
credits
que componentes
or
y piezas
power
norteamericanas
or
entren a
spare
Cuba.
parts
El
from the United
bloqueo
States to
impide
come into
que no
Cuba
haya combustible.
or
¿Qué país
from
puede
fuel to come
funcionar
into
sin
Cuba.
combustible?
What
Si
country
Estados
can
Unidos no
operate
tuviera
without fuel?
combustible,
What
¿qué
happens in the
pasaría
US
con
if they
Estados
didn't have
Unidos?
access to
Incluso
oil? Even in
Estados
the
Unidos, que
US,
tiene reservas
when
de
they have
combustible
reserves for
para
oil in order
mantener
to
su
maintain their levels
consumismo
of
y su
consumption,
desarrollo,
they have
ha
invaded
invadido
other
otros
countries
países
in
para
order to
apoderarse
take
del
over the
combustible
fuel
de
and
sus
the oil
países.
of
Y
other
entonces
countries.
en Cuba
And
pasa
in
lo
Cuba, it's the
contrario.
other way around.
A Cuba no nos dejan.
We are not
Y,
allowed to get
y
fuel
si
like
fuéramos un
we
Estado
are a
fallido,
failed state. And
en
in the
medio
middle
de
of this
esas
situation,
condiciones, este Estado
this
superó la
country
COVID
overcame
con
COVID
vacunas cubanas
using Cuban
por el
vaccines
desarrollo
based on
científico de
Cuba's
Cuba.
scientific
Ningún Estado fallido tiene un
development.
desarrollo
No
científico como el que tenemos
failed
nosotros.
state has a
Fuimos
scientific development like we do. We had better indicators of fighting COVID, even better than the US, with their scientific potential. And this is only because our system ensures, within its limitation, a universal healthcare system, education, universal system, and culture and sport as the rights of our people, and we do that for free, and we allow.
And Cuban doctors are known around the world. Cuban doctors are known and respected around the world. There is no doubt about that. But you are trading with the Chinese, you are trading with some European countries. Why not go a step further and adopt the China or Vietnam model, where they've opened up their markets and accepted that a rigid communist system hasn't worked?
We've been able to do all these things, but the main culprit of the problems that we're facing right now is the United States. For instance, there are more than 67,000 newborns in Cuba that require some special medications, and they have a limitation in terms of drugs and medicines that are required to keep them alive. And Cuba cannot provide this medical care. Are we limited because of the Cuban system or the Cuban government, or because of the blockade? Our infant mortality rate was 4 per 1,000 live births a few years ago, and that rate is now 9.2 per 1,000 live births. Does it have to be? Is it connected to the worsening of the blockade? We have 34,000 mothers, pregnant mothers, who are at risk, and they require special care that we cannot provide fully as a result of the impact of the blockade. We have more than 1,000 cancer patients, including 12,000 kids who require cancer treatment, and 16,000 patients who require radiotherapy, and 16,000 people who require dialysis, and we don't have the resources today as a result of the impact of the blockade. They speak to us about China and Vietnam. We have analyzed China's and Vietnam's experiences, and we have theoretical exchanges with them, but they were not under long blockades of 60 years like Cuba. Their blockades were shorter, and after that they were declared as the most favored nation by the U.S., and that has not been the position of the United States against Cuba. We've been harassed,
do you think,
and as part of that harassment by the U.S., we've been able to overcome the blockade. And I think what has failed is the U.S. policy, using that maximum pressure policy, which has been recognized by the president. And they said, we have used maximum pressure, there's nothing else that we can do rather than obliterate.
The criticism.
So what has failed is that they have not been able to crush us. And we are part of our people, and we try to build everything with the people's participation, and we recognize that we've made mistakes. For example, we were waiting for a better time in order to introduce a number of measures that could improve the economy. We were waiting.
And I've seen the 200 reforms.
Even like this, these measures are going to find a difficult time to be implemented because of the blockade, because there's not going to be more fuel, because we're applying
well, many
those measures.
economists,
As long as there's a blockade,
you've put into
those
place,
things are going to be limited.
you've put into place,
If we are so incapable,
you've put into place,
why don't they lift the blockade? Lift the blockade, and let's see how the chips may fall. If we are that incapable, if we are that incompetent, if we are so unable to develop our country, don't blockade me. Why are you blocking me? Let me
criticism
on my own and see whether I'll succeed or if I follow my own. And I'm sure that we will succeed. And even with this blockade,
the criticism, Mr. President, is that you have the Cuban economy is highly centralized, highly unproductive economy, large public sector. You haven't allowed the private sector to thrive or have any private sector, apart from now opening it up slightly. Heavy reliance on oil imports, and of course the tourism industry, which you've relied on, has been decimated. So it is partially the system that you've adopted for decades, well beyond this latest blockade in January, which has obviously forced your country to struggle.
Your view is that the system is what has done all this. I'll show you from my point of view that I disagree with that position, because a lot of lies are being said and because the reality of the country is being ignored. When for the last 10 years the country has been introducing a number of updates into its social and economic model. For example, land in Cuba is owned in more than 80% by private actors in the economy. And still, the agriculture has not been able to make progress, and we have not been able to achieve a fully sustainable agriculture and achieve food sovereignty because of the impact of the blockade on agriculture. More than 80% of the agricultural production is being produced by non-state actors. The Secretary of State doesn't have that figure, or the President doesn't know that. Let's talk about tourism. We used to get 4 million tourists a few years ago, and the tourism industry was one of the main industries in the country. When we had those revenues, we were able to maintain certain level of maintenance in the power plants. We didn't have those power cuts as we do today. We had a stable exchange market. We had a steady supply of food for our population and a steady supply of raw materials for our productions, and we could do some exports. During the first administration of President Trump, he applied 247 measures tightening the blockade and put us in a list of countries that supposedly sponsor terrorism. That cut off all of the ways of support. And using the Title 10 of Title 3 of Helms-Burton Act, they shut off the coming of American tourists. You can not come as tourists to Cuba. In addition, they have in Europe this they have this ESTA, which allowed European citizens to come to the U.S. using very simple visa procedures. And then the U.S. government said that if anyone could come to Cuba as a tourist, they would become ineligible for the ESTA tourists in the U.S. And that cut off the flow of tourists from Cuba, from Europe to Cuba.
And
when they applied the energy fuel and the executive order, airlines that would bring tourists stop coming here because they don't have fuel here. So the problem is on the Cuban economy, who were receiving 4 million tourists a year, and hotels very good and a very nice tourist destination, or is it the blockade that wants... Let me finish.
Mr. President.
Once they realize the effectiveness of the blockade and that policy,
I understand,
they shut off everything. Who is the culprit here? Who is the real culprit here?
I want to put to you what the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been saying. He has accused security apparatus linked to your government, Gaesa, of corruption, mismanagement. He says there are estimates that somewhere between 40 to 70% of the country's economy sits in the hands of this apparatus, and it is enjoyed by the elites and not by the regular Cuban people. That's why we're seeing blackouts. That's why we're seeing shortages. That's why we're seeing the hunger. Do you acknowledge that there is corruption, there is mismanagement, which has led to this as well?
First of all, the person that is saying all this has no knowledge about the circumstances in which Gaesa was established or how the Cuban business community is built. Gaesa was established in the early years of the special period when we were going through a very difficult times, quite comparable to this time. The socialist bloc disappeared, our main allies were gone. Cuba lost more than 75% of its markets for international trade, and we lost about 13 million tons of oil that we used to get in order to compensate our exports to other products to the socialist bloc, mainly sugar, and so those were very difficult conditions. At the time, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba, so that they would not become a burden for the economy of the country, developed a business model, and they developed a number of industries, and they're not part of GAESA. They developed construction companies, industrial companies, scientific centers, and they also developed GAESA that has a significant component in terms of investment for tourism. With the development of this business system, which is not the only one in the country, the armed forces were able to ensure their self-sufficiency and not depend on the national economy, so that the national economy could be used for the need to meet the needs of the population. And they also contributed, and they continue to contribute part of their productions to the national economy and for the population, in addition to covering their own needs of the armed forces. In addition, most of those revenues were coming to the state, and the state used them to develop a number of projects. When those 240 plus measures were implemented, and we were designated a country supposedly sponsoring terrorism, and then we had COVID and we had to face COVID, and at the time we started to face shortages of medicines, hard currency. Tourism was declining because of the blockade policy. We were having difficulties with transport and medicines. We used those funds in order for us to survive in those years. And with those funds, we were able to buy medicines and raw materials for our pharmaceutical industry to produce medicines. We would use those funds in order to buy food, to provide a food basket at subsidized prices for all of the population of the country. They also made a significant contribution for the energy transition of the country, and those funds were used for the production of food for our population. First, there is a total lack of knowledge as to how this business system was established and the important contribution they've made to the Cuban economy. And they're not the only ones participating in the Cuban economy. Right now, in the Cuban economy, there is a state-owned business system, GAESA, and there's a significant movement of private entrepreneurs. There are more than 16,000 private players in Cuba, and there's a very high number of sole proprietors, and this is not mentioned, and this is ignored. They don't speak about
are
this.
They supporting?
And the relationship between the state-owned and the private sector, they don't speak about that in the Cuban economy. In Cuba, the levels of corruption...
But are they supporting the Cuban economy now? Because I'm speaking to people who are saying their monthly salary is like $14 a month or $20 a month. You know, when you talk about the Cuban economy, it is crumbling.
As part of this tightening of the blockade, a part of the economy has become paralyzed. The state-owned economy is more paralyzed than the private sector, because even when the private sector is enduring the effects and the impact of the blockade, they have different ways to overcome those impacts. But those Cubans who live in Cuba, whether they're private players or state-owned players, they're working for the Cuban people. We have inflation. There is an imbalance in terms of the purchasing power and the salaries, because we're going through a crisis. We've been condemned to an economic crisis. They're trying to suffocate and stifle our economy. And through that economic suffocation, they're trying to have a social
You've acknowledged
uprising.
that it's not just the blockade. You have acknowledged this to your party. You have said that there are factors that are internal that are not linked to the blockade. What examples do you have here?
Agreed, but let me say this. Regardless of those factors, the main cause for the complex economic and social situation our country is going through are not the internal mistakes and errors that we've made, but rather the impact on everyday life by the blockade, because those mistakes that we have recognized and we have overcome at other times in our lives, and we've been able to achieve social achievements and that the United States don't have. The level of participation, the level in healthcare, the level of education and higher education that we have, the level of equality that we've been able to achieve. What happens is that this U.S. policy is criminal. We're talking about a genocidal policy. We're talking about a precept that was first advanced in 1960 by a memo by Lester Mallory.
You don't think
for Cuba.
You don't think for decades the policies you've put in place have brought
Cuba not to receive exports, so that the situation of the salary and the shortages would lead to a social uprising.
So you don't take responsibility for the policies that have existed in this country for decades that have left you vulnerable, so that when this sort of blockade, these sanctions are imposed, you have a system that hasn't allowed your market to open up?
I don't think our policies have been vulnerable. Our policies don't have been vulnerable. Our policies have been successful, because if we've been able to survive in spite of the blockade, that's because our policies are effective. What happens is, why are they going to tell us that the aspiration should be the market? Who said that the market is going to ensure equality and social justice? We have a market, and we also need to look at the rules of the market, because we don't let the market to control the situation. We try and favor the most vulnerable ones, the ones who have more problems, the pensioners. And not always have we been able to achieve what we want with our social policies as a result of the limitations of the blockade. Because in order to have social justice and develop social programs, you need to have an economy to support that. For instance, in Cuba, all children go to school, regardless of their origin, regardless of what they believe in, regardless of their skin color, and they have access to a robust and free education system that is recognized globally. And the U.S. don't have that. In Cuba, everyone can go to the university and have a university degree and a master's program, even have a doctorate without having to pay a penny for it, regardless of our background or the economic possibilities of the family. In Cuba, you can enjoy culture, you can enjoy sports. Aren't those achievements? Are these achievements the result of a failed social policy, or is it that social policy which is not based on the market but rather based on solidarity, social justice, equality and inclusion is the policy that is bothering, because it is showing that another world is possible. And this is the model that many people around the world are defending, for which Cuba is a hope and an example.
Mr. President, I want to ask you about some reports that Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch have done. They've said that dissent in Cuba is met with harassment, criminalization, violence, house arrest, and torture. Marco Rubio has made a point of this and says you repress anyone who dares to complain. I just want to ask you about several hundred political prisoners and activist journalists who remain in prison from the protests that took place a few years ago. There are those who have put banners up and have been arrested. I want to ask you about some of these specific cases and the human rights concerns in this country. So for example, I want to ask about Leonard Richard Gonzalez Alfonso. He's in prison. He's serving seven years for putting up a poster in the city. Why is he in prison?
Usually references you've had are quite amazing. I mean, what Marco Rubio says, what Trump has said, what Amnesty International has said. I would kindly ask you to look for other references as well. And you're in Cuba and you can find other points of view. This is also something that has been very manipulated. And there is a narrative construct for many years against the revolution in order to discredit the Cuban revolution. In Cuba, there are no political prisoners. In Cuba, the people who are serving prison terms are not serving those terms, not because they are in favor or not against the revolution, but they have committed offenses in our criminal code, in our civil code. Regarding the protests, there are a number of people that have been funded and financed by the United States, and in that desire to express themselves against the revolution, not only have they expressed themselves against the revolution, which lots of people do that on a daily basis. On social media, in our everyday life, there are people that are against the revolution, who are and people who are in favor of the revolution, who are also bothered and not satisfied, and they're not in jail. So some people, using that as an excuse, commit vandalism, and those who commit vandalism against the security of the country, disrupting internal order, are indicted and tried with due process like they would anywhere else in the world, including the United States, because there is repression and police brutality and bad treatment of against the black people is the American society, not the Cuban society. For example, July the 11th, which is one of the events that is the object of lots of manipulation. The July 11th protest, which was part of a very difficult situation, we were beginning to suffer some of the limitations as a result of the tightening of the blockade, with the pressures implemented and the measures implemented by Trump, which Biden maintained, and the pandemic. Very long power cuts, shortage of medicines. When our oxygen plant broke down, the U.S. government prevented other companies to sell oxygen to us, and we had to do a lot of things in order to keep people from dying. We didn't have any possibility to have access to vaccines, and we had to develop our own vaccines. Okay, in the middle of that situation, we had the July the 11th protest. There were 30,000 people. There are no 35,000 people in jail. Eventually, 700 people were processed, and many of them didn't go to trial because there were some of them young people, and they received a different treatment, working with the family, direct care with the schools. And those who committed vandalism, acts of vandalism, stealing, breaching public order against the security forces, were indicted as they would anywhere else in the world. Many of them in various pardons that we gave, not only for the pardons that were given not only for these people, but general pardons that were given for some inmates. Many of them were released before they completed their terms. In particular, I wouldn't be able to speak of specific cases, but in Cuba, I can tell you that no one is in jail because their ideas are against the revolution, because we are fully aware that not all of the population is in favor of the revolution. But we do not allow that anyone, on the basis that they are against the revolution, commit acts of vandalism, because there is a safety that we are not willing to let anyone to break it. And many times those people who engage in acts of vandalism, it is later demonstrated that they were paid and they were financed by U.S. government operators.
And I know that you want to, I'm just being told.
And the other thing is, if they believe that there is torture, show me who have been tortured. Give them, let them give evidence of anyone who has been tortured
Mr. President,
or tried because they protested and not because they committed acts of vandalism.
Many reports on the United States and its allies.
Ask how many people in the United States have
and Amnesty does many reports on America and the...
One recent example. Where are the legal evidence of the executions conducted by the United States in the Caribbean Sea, supposedly because they are drug dealers? Where's the evidence of those people who have died?
And Amnesty does many reports on that, which is what I was trying to get at.
The world is condemning that, and the world is asking for answers about that. Who is going to take up the responsibility of all the Palestinians that have been killed in the Gaza Strip, or the children that were killed in when an Iranian school was bombed? We have many questions to ask as well for the U.S. government. That government that is building that narrative, suggesting that we are dictators and oppressing. We're not that kind of person. I can tell you that in full honesty.
We can spoken for an hour, and I just want to ask you where you think the situation is going to go for you, your country. How do you think this is going to end?
We have set out a whole process of improving our society. Regardless of the elements that we discussed in the early questions as to how we are preparing ourselves to defend ourselves, which is not an aggressive concept, but rather defensive concept, and specifically to avoid confrontation. We do have an economic strategy in order to continue our socialist construction in the most adverse situation, which is the longest-running blockade in history by the mightiest power in history. And now, with the added fuel blockade, we have a political outlook to increase the involvement of the population in the main decision-making processes, and for the population to have greater elements in decision-making and also in the popular control in the enforcement of those things, so that everything is transparent. And we're working very hard on the community level and the participation of the people at the community level, and we're giving the young people a lot of participation in our society. Furthermore, we're also developing and improving our social policies, seeking to achieve equality and diminish inequalities that recently we've seen an increase as a result of this situation. They speak so much about market. And now the first time when we started to see social inequalities was in the 1990s, when hard currency was deregulated, because people were differentiated not because of their contribution and their work, but rather because their ability to have foreign currency or not. So one element of the one market element introduced social inequality. So we try to respond to that with social policies aimed at redistribution of wealth towards the neediest one, the most vulnerable. We are aware that in order to do that, we need to secure the unity of our people. And I always say that unity is achieved and enhanced with greater participation, having all kinds of debates and having many spaces of participation. We also have the challenge of maintaining an ideological continuity of the revolution, and that's why we are beating on the participation of the young and the youth in the process of the revolution. We also have the challenge to face this criminal, vicious, tightened blockade against our revolution. And we know that we have to do that on our own. We have to be able to overcome the challenges and limitations caused by the blockade on the basis of our own efforts, our own talent, and our own creativity. And the Cuban people is very creative. And one of the pillars that we have defended is science and innovation, because we have a great innovative capacity as part of the development of science in our country. Furthermore, we also have to deal with a huge media-driven campaign that is trying to intoxicate everything Cuba and everything around the Cuban Revolution. And yes, we have shortages in terms of food, transport, medicine, energy. We have those shortages. But there is no power cut that would shut off hope in Cuba. There is no shortages that will crush the Cuban willingness. the willingness of the Cuban people amid so many difficult situations. The Cuban people can organize at the social level and in their communities using that solidarity among all our fellow Cubans and stick together. And in these conditions, on a daily basis, without transport, our doctors and nurses walk to their workplaces in order to save human lives. Without power, without electricity, our teachers are teaching. Without fuel, our agricultural workers are producing food for the people. Without energy, a significant part of our companies, and when I say companies, I mean both state-owned and private companies, are making every effort in order to ensure a production that would provide greater services and goods for our people, and also exports, so that we can improve the relationship in terms of the purchasing power and the salary and the prices. That is the kind of people that we are, people that we are decided not to kneel down, not to give in, that we have suffered a lot, and we have received a collective punishment without any justification at all. So with this outlook, which has not been built by the central leadership, but rather these have emanated as part of the popular debate that we've maintained for the last 10 years, and we've been updating policies and concepts and proposals with a contribution made by those discussions and with what I've called creative resistance, which is not only resisting, but resisting and growing and overcoming adversity. I'm sure that the future of the country, although it'll be difficult and it'll be a long road, I'm sure that the future will be one of prosperity and victory.
Mr. President, thank you so much. Thank you. Really gracious. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you.